Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
My sister didn't just ask me to move. She didn't make a scene, didn't raise her voice or call attention to it, not directly. No, she leaned in close, smiled with those glossy lips of hers, and whispered it like a secret meant to sound like a joke. Jen, maybe you'd be more comfortable at the other table. You know, where it's a little more relaxed. Her tone had that tight cheerfulness, the kind that only shows up when someone's lying but too proud to admit it. And just like that, without even blinking, she erased me from her polished little world. We were at some high-end rooftop restaurant in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the wine list has its own menu and they charge $20 for something called compressed cucumber. I remember I showed up wearing my favorite cardigan. It had tiny embroidered flowers all over it, a bit frayed at the sleeves, and sure, maybe I didn't look like the rest of the table. With their slick suits and angular dresses and business watches that cost more than my entire car. But I'd been invited. Lisa had called me the week before and said, "It's a big night, Jen. I'd love it if you came. These are important people. Just be yourself." So I was. I was myself. And apparently, that was the damn problem. It wasn't until I was sitting at the bar, 2 tables away, sipping a flat soda water and pretending I couldn't hear her laugh echoing across the rooftop, that I caught what she really thought. One of the women at her table, a thin blonde in a steel blue pantsuit, had leaned in and asked, "Was that your sister?" And Lisa had smiled, the kind of smile you make when you're swallowing something sour. "Yeah," she said, too quickly. "She's sweet. Just not someone who gets it, you know? She's more small town, garage inventor vibe. A little embarrassing." And then she laughed. Not loud. Just enough. Enough to make it clear. That word, embarrassing, landed like a slow punch to the gut. I'd heard worse in my life, sure. But nothing cuts like hearing your own blood say it with ease, with certainty, and in front of strangers like you're some punchline she's been dragging around since childhood. I didn't say a word. Didn't storm out or confront her or cause a scene, because what would be the point? That whole table reeked of careful performance. Nobody cared who I was. Nobody even turned around when I stood up and quietly paid for my drink, leaving a tip bigger than the bill just to prove, to no one in particular, that I wasn't cheap or bitter or defeated. I walked down 3 flights of stairs in silence, each step louder than the last in my clogs that squeaked on the marble tile. I got in my car, a faded silver Volvo with a cracked dashboard and a sticky radio dial, and drove home with my hands clenched so hard on the wheel I left crescent marks on my palms. That drive home was long and too quiet, and the silence only gave space to every memory I'd tried to bury for years. Lisa and I used to be close, at least before everything changed, before she became the rising star and I became, well, garage inventor vibe. I was the one who helped her study for college placement tests, the one who edited every application essay, the one who covered rent with temp jobs so she could chase her internships. I didn't complain. I was proud of her. Even when she started climbing the tech ladder and talking in buzzwords I had to Google, I clapped the loudest. But somewhere along the way, my loyalty turned invisible. I stopped being her sister and became her shadow, something she'd rather not have in the room when the lighting was too good. When I got home that night, I didn't cry. That's not me. I'm not built for drama or emotional monologues. I'm built for work, for problem solving, for picking myself up quietly and finding the one lever that still moves the whole system. So instead of feeling sorry for myself, I went into the garage. It was cold and smelled faintly of oil and pine from the old shelf where I used to keep holiday decorations. Most people would have seen it as a mess, a scattered collection of wires, notebooks, half-built gadgets, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams only I could understand. But to me, it was the only place where things made sense. It was my haven, my test site, my workshop. And in the far corner, under a dusty tarp, was a project I hadn't touched in almost 2 years. I pulled it back like I was peeling the scab off a wound I wasn't sure had healed. There it was, compact, rusted at the hinges, a bit of a Frankenstein monster of circuit boards and broken casings, but still mine. A hardware-software hybrid I'd spent 5 years building before I shelved it. Something that could change how legacy businesses used automation, something designed not to replace workers, but to empower them. Simple, stable, adaptable. But I never had the funding, never had the platform. And after Lisa's startup sucked all the oxygen out of the room, after she started selling her human-free AI streamlining model like it was the second coming of Steve Jobs, no one wanted to hear about my inclusive system. But that night, as I looked down at it, something shifted. I didn't want Lisa's spotlight. I didn't want her investors or her interviews or her glossy events with tiny portions of food. I wanted her to regret underestimating me. I wanted her to realize that the sister she laughed off as embarrassing was the very person who could destroy everything she'd built with her perfectly manicured hands. So I grabbed my notebook, a flashlight, and a screwdriver, and I got to work. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. It wasn't about vengeance. Not yet. At that moment, it was just about proving something to myself. That I wasn't broken. That I wasn't done. That maybe, just maybe, Lisa wasn't the only one in the family capable of building an empire. And as I turned that first bolt, a thought settled into the back of my mind like a whisper that refused to leave. You don't have to yell to be dangerous. You just have to be ready when no one's looking. Because I wasn't going to beg for a seat at her table. I was going to build a bigger one and watch hers collapse. For most of my life, I've lived in the kind of rhythm that doesn't get headlines or applause or even much acknowledgement, a rhythm that hums in the background like an old refrigerator, steady and unspectacular, the kind of life you only miss when it's gone. While Lisa was climbing stages and posing with microphones, giving TED-style talks about disruption and innovation, I was in my garage with my sleeves rolled up, soldering wires by hand and muttering to myself about current flow and failover redundancy. I wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads in boardrooms or got featured on tech panels, not because I lacked knowledge or drive or creativity, but because I didn't speak the right language or wear the right shoes or filter my words through a PR department. And the truth is, I used to think that made me invisible. But after that night on the rooftop, after being politely exiled to the bar like a well-meaning embarrassment, I realized something that shook me to my core. Invisibility is power when no one sees you coming. So I started digging through my old notebooks, my design files, my half-written pitch decks from the days when I still believed someone might fund a woman over 40 with no glossy resume and no venture capital connections. I pulled open drawers filled with obsolete hardware, traced through lines of spaghetti code I'd once written in a caffeine haze, and slowly, methodically, piece by piece, I began to bring it back to life. The thing about building something with your hands, whether it's a table or a software suite, is that there's no shortcut, no elevator to the top floor. You grind. You fail. You patch. You cry a little at 3 in the morning when the build crashes for the 5th time and the screen goes dark without warning. But if you're stubborn enough, and I've been told stubborn is my defining feature, you keep going. The prototype wasn't much to look at in those early days. It sat on my workbench like a Frankenstein monster of recycled parts, old Raspberry Pi units stacked like sandwich bread, thermal sensors taped together with electrical glue, and wires splayed across the table like veins with no blood. But beneath the mess, it had a soul, an engine built from the idea that automation didn't have to mean elimination, that machines could work with people rather than replace them. I had designed it specifically for the kinds of businesses that Lisa's startup targeted for disruption: family-owned manufacturers, local service shops, community-based logistics hubs. The kinds of places where people still shook hands after meetings and knew their employees' kids by name. Lisa's company, Miratech, had built its brand on the notion that human error was the enemy of progress, that cutting payrolls was a smart financial pivot, and that algorithms were cleaner, faster, and infinitely more scalable than flesh and blood workers. They wrapped it in polished language, lean optimization, frictionless deployment, decision intelligence modules, but the result was always the same. People got replaced by code, and the ones left behind got told to upskill or move on. I wasn't buying it. I'd spent enough time on factory floors and in back offices to know that you can't code loyalty, you can't automate instinct, and you sure as hell can't replace wisdom with predictive metrics. My system didn't aim to replace people, it aimed to enhance them. Still, no one wants to be the first to bet on the underdog. Especially when the underdog doesn't look the part. Every time I sent a cold email, I braced for silence. Every time I followed up, I expected to be ghosted. But I kept pushing. I recorded a shaky demo video with a webcam duct taped to a lamp and posted it to a private YouTube link, sent it with a heartfelt note to 20 small business owners across the Midwest, and waited. The first response came from a man named Bill Rydell, who ran a mid-sized automotive parts manufacturer in Indiana. His email was short, to the point. Can you come out and show me what this thing does? I borrowed my neighbor Omar's van, loaded up the prototype in the back wrapped in an old blanket, and made the 4-hour drive with nothing but gas station coffee and 2 granola bars to keep me company. I didn't dress up. I didn't rehearse a pitch. I showed up as myself, hair in a ponytail, no makeup, and with the unmistakable look of someone who'd spent 3 weeks sleeping next to a Linux server. And when I set up the demo on the floor of Bill's warehouse, surrounded by grease-stained workbenches and buzzing fluorescent lights, I realized something profound. This was my boardroom. These were my people. The demo didn't just go well, it blew the damn roof off. The system integrated with Bill's legacy software in under an hour, streamlined his inventory management in real time, and suggested optimizations his consultants hadn't mentioned in 6 months of strategy meetings. But the moment that sealed it wasn't technical. It was when one of his longtime employees, Frank, I think his name was, looked at the interface and said, "Wait, so this thing doesn't replace me? It helps me do more." And when I said yes, his eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. That's when Bill shook my hand and said, "Let's do a pilot." Driving home that night, with the prototype strapped down and the Indiana wind howling through a cracked window, I didn't feel victorious or smug or even relieved. I felt electric. Like something had shifted, like I'd crossed an invisible line from being a person who hoped for permission to someone who no longer needed it. I didn't care if I was polished. I didn't care if I was marketable. What I had worked. And that meant I was dangerous. By the time I got back to my garage, I already had 5 voicemails. 3 were from other business owners who had seen the demo Bill recorded. 1 was from a local tech blogger who somehow got wind of the project. And 1, this was the one that made my hands go numb, was from a procurement officer at a regional logistics firm that had recently rejected Lisa's pitch deck. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the garage, tightening screws, rewriting code, and drawing up the first real deployment map. My system had no name yet, no brand, no sleek website. But it had momentum. And momentum, once it starts, doesn't care about pedigree or polish. It only cares about direction. Lisa didn't know I was building. She didn't know I was moving. She certainly didn't know I was coming. But when she did find out, she'd realized something she'd forgotten a long time ago, something she probably never understood in the first place. You don't need a seat at the table if you know how to build your own. And I was already halfway through construction. There's a certain point in the process, somewhere after the exhaustion stops feeling physical and becomes something more like a presence living behind your eyes, that you stop tracking time the way normal people do. Days blur into nights, meals become a handful of peanuts or something microwaved and forgotten, and conversations with yourself start sounding alarmingly reasonable. That's the space I was in, somewhere between delirium and obsession, when I realized I had crossed from hopeful tinkerer to someone with an actual product, something with teeth, with market viability, with enough raw usefulness to make people in power start sweating a little. But unlike Lisa, I didn't have an entourage of Ivy League grads polishing my decks or an advisory board made up of ex-Google this and former Facebook that. What I had was 1 prototype, 1 successful pilot, a growing list of referrals, and a stubborn refusal to shut up or sit still, no matter how many people pretended not to see me. The irony of it all was that, for the first time in over a decade, I was finally doing what Lisa claimed she respected, innovating. Only I wasn't doing it on a stage with lighting cues and digital slides, but from the basement of my own damn house, with a secondhand monitor, a whiteboard scarred with years of eraser ghosts, and a war chest that consisted of my drained savings account and a high-limit credit card that made my hands shake every time I used it. But grit doesn't come with a balance sheet. It grows in silence, in late nights, in the sheer indignity of being underestimated for so long that even your victories feel like rebellion. The system I was building, which I had finally decided to name Junosync, a blend of my name and the concept of synchronization, was beginning to attract real attention. It wasn't viral, it wasn't flashy, and it didn't promise to replace 5 departments with one click, but it worked. It worked better than anyone expected, especially in industries where digital transformation usually meant someone with a clipboard and a half-finished Excel sheet. The logistics firm in Indiana rolled out the beta version across 3 locations, then immediately asked for expansion to 12. A manufacturing outfit in Michigan came on board after watching a YouTube demo posted by a tech blogger I'd never met. Every time someone said, "We've been looking for something like this," I felt a strange kind of anger bubble up behind the pride, anger that this had always been possible, but no one had been listening because I didn't wear the right damn blazer. Then, one Tuesday morning, foggy and damp, the kind where coffee feels like oxygen, I got an email that made me sit up so fast I nearly knocked my mug onto the keyboard. The subject line was simple: interested in a conversation. Halgren Systems. At first, I thought it was spam or some cruel joke from one of Lisa's overly clever friends, but no. Halgren was real. A mid-tier enterprise solutions firm, the kind of company that liked to play both sides of the AI war, partnering with flashy startups like Lisa's Miratech while also quietly funding more practical tools to hedge their bets. The body of the email was direct, no frills. They'd heard about Junosync from a client referral and were interested in seeing a demo. The address they gave me for the meeting nearly made my hands go cold. It wasn't just any building. It was the same downtown Chicago tech tower where Lisa's company had its headquarters. The same damn glass tomb she had taken me to once, years ago, when she first launched Miratech and wanted to show off the office view. I remember she'd stood by the window like she owned the whole skyline, talking about disruption and future markets and how some people just weren't built to scale. And now, I was about to walk into that same building with a working product under my arm and a pitch that didn't need flash, it only needed truth. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Omar, not the clients, not even my mom. I wanted to walk in without pressure, without expectations, without anyone telling me to remember my manners or speak their language. I didn't wear a power suit. I wore what I always wore: jeans, boots, a dark sweater, and my lucky silver bracelet that had belonged to our grandmother, the one who used to fix tractors with her bare hands and didn't care one bit if someone called her hands too rough or her voice too loud. I carried the prototype in a canvas bag I'd patched 3 times. I didn't try to look like I belonged. I knew I did. The reception area was all glass and steel and forced smiles, the kind of place that makes you feel like an intruder unless you're accompanied by someone wearing a name badge with a QR code. I gave my name, and the woman at the desk typed it in with mechanical disinterest, her expression flickering only slightly when the system pinged back an appointment. She pointed me toward the elevators and gave me a visitor badge with a neutral, "Good luck." I didn't need luck. I needed 30 minutes, a power outlet, and a chance to speak without being interrupted. The elevator opened on the 20th floor, and there she was. Lisa. Standing 10 feet from the Halgren conference room, arms folded, talking to a man in a blue suit who glanced in my direction, and then quickly turned away like I might ask him for spare change. She hadn't seen me yet, not really. Her eyes skimmed past me before flicking back, widening for a fraction of a second, and then narrowing just enough for me to see that little flash of disbelief, like her brain hadn't caught up to what she was seeing. I didn't slow down. I didn't smile. I walked straight past her without a word, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and entered the room where 2 Halgren directors were already waiting. The pitch wasn't perfect, my slides were bare bones, my hands shook for the first few minutes, and I had to reboot the demo unit twice due to a port issue, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that every question they asked, I answered with certainty. Every objection they raised, I countered with data. When they asked about scalability, I showed them the Michigan rollout metrics. When they asked about implementation time, I handed them deployment blueprints with annotated schedules. And when they finally leaned back, exchanged that subtle glance executives always use when they're impressed, but trying not to show it, I knew I had cleared the impossible hurdle. One of the directors, a woman named Patrice with sharp eyes and a voice like cold water, leaned forward at the end and said, "You know, Miratech pitched us last quarter. We almost moved forward, but something felt off. Too much flash. Not enough backbone." She tapped the table lightly. "You've got backbone." As I packed up my things, I heard footsteps outside the door, quick, clipped heels on tile. Lisa was standing by the coffee station, pretending not to be listening, but her jaw was clenched, and her hands were stiff. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. She'd seen everything she needed to see. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I didn't smile or cry or even breathe deeply. I just held onto the railing and whispered, "You had investors, Lisa." I had grit. And grit wins longer than flash every single time. There is a specific kind of silence that descends when someone who once dismissed you realizes, too late, that they underestimated the wrong person, a silence so thick it presses against the walls and hangs in the air like smoke. Impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to confront without unraveling something deeper and darker than either of you are willing to name. That was the silence I walked into a week after the pitch meeting at Halgren Systems, when Lisa, dressed in the same sharp blazer and perfectly fitted pants that she probably thought gave her power, appeared at my front door without warning and stood there like a ghost of my former life, mouth tight, eyes sharp, and posture tense enough to snap. She didn't knock at first. She just stood there with one hand on her hip and the other clenching the strap of a sleek leather tote bag like it was a weapon, waiting for me to open the door after she rang the bell once, twice, and then a third time with increasing urgency. I knew exactly why she was there. Word had already begun to spread, whispers moving quickly through the venture capital networks and enterprise tech circles that something was happening, something that wasn't Lisa for once, something they hadn't predicted, hadn't invested in, and couldn't wrap in a brand package with buzzwords and glossy launch events. It didn't take long after the Halgren meeting for the dominoes to start falling in my favor. They signed a partnership agreement within 4 days that I spent refreshing my inbox every 10 minutes, pacing the garage like a woman possessed, and trying to remember how to breathe without counting every second. They didn't just want a trial. They wanted integration, scale, exclusivity for 6 verticals, and a 6-month rollout across 29 regional locations, with full deployment support and joint marketing rights. It was, for lack of a better phrase, a massive damn deal, big enough to wipe out my debt, hire a proper development team, and put Junosync in the kind of position most tech founders dream of reaching only after years of failing forward. Lisa found out because, of course, she would. Miratech had been circling Halgren for months, teasing solutions, offering partnership packages, and presenting glossy decks full of visionary solutions that promised disruption at scale with minimal risk, only to be passed over, quietly and without explanation, in favor of a company run out of a suburban garage by a woman they had all written off as a non-player. And Lisa, for all her polish and control, didn't take rejection well. So when I opened the door that morning and saw her standing there, I didn't feel triumph or vindication or even anger. I just felt tired. Tired of the games, tired of being judged for not speaking the right dialect of ambition, tired of pretending like her approval mattered. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Can we talk?" she asked, and without waiting for a response, she stepped past me into the foyer like she still had the right to do so, like nothing had changed and everything was still on her terms. I didn't stop her. I closed the door, leaned against it, and waited. She turned in the hallway, arms crossed, lips tight, and delivered the line she had clearly rehearsed in her head a dozen times before coming over. "You don't know what you're doing, Jenna. You're in over your head." The words didn't hit the way she expected them to. There was no sting, no rush of doubt or panic. I had already walked through fire and come out the other side, and hearing her say those words now was like listening to someone repeat an old insult that had long since lost its edge. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what was underneath the bravado: fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what I represented, a crack in her carefully curated reality, A reminder that success isn't always about polish or pedigree, that sometimes it's about persistence, about showing up day after day and building something with your bare hands while the world laughs behind your back. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence do the work. Then I said, calmly and without malice, if I'm in over my head, Lisa, then you're drowning. She blinked. Just once. But it was enough. She tried to pivot then, to regain control, shifting into her CEO voice, the one I'd seen her use in meetings when she needed to dominate a conversation without raising her volume. You don't understand the pressure. This isn't some feel-good project anymore. These people you're dealing with? They'll chew you up. You don't know how to scale. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the team. It was true. I didn't have the team. Yet. But I had the momentum, the trust, the demand. And more than that, I had the truth. Clients believed in Junosync not because I promised them the moon, but because I showed up, solved problems, and respected their experience. I didn't treat them like outdated models to be discarded. I treated them like partners. I didn't fight her. I didn't argue or try to prove her wrong. Instead, I walked over to the coffee table, picked up a stack of signed contracts, and handed them to her without a word. She scanned the top pages, and I watched the realization dawn in real time. This wasn't just a fluke. This was real. This was happening. And it was happening without her. She didn't say much after that. She set the contracts down carefully, like they might burn her fingers if she wasn't gentle, and then turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she stopped and said, "You're going to regret this." Maybe I would, but not for the reasons she thought. That night, I got a call from my mother, who never called after dark unless something was wrong. Her voice was tight, trembling, and she didn't even say hello before blurting, "Why is Lisa crying in my guest room?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know how to explain to my mother that her golden daughter, the one with the startup and the headlines and the expensive coats, had been beaten not by the world, but by the very woman she'd tried to erase. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and listened to my mother try to make sense of the emotional wreckage without understanding the years of small cuts that led to this moment. And I said, slowly, "She's crying because for the first time, she lost." And I didn't feel guilty. Because I hadn't taken anything from her. She had handed it to me. The moment she called me embarrassing, the moment she told the world I didn't belong, she made her choice. All I did was finish the story. There's a strange hollowness that comes when you finally get the thing you've been chasing, especially when that thing isn't a person or a place or even a prize, but a reckoning, a quiet, intimate moment of vindication that lives not in celebration or applause, but in the empty space left behind when rage runs out and pride no longer burns quite as bright. That was the feeling that settled in my chest the morning after the Halgren deal was announced publicly, when emails started pouring in from consultants, implementation leads, legal teams, and brand advisors offering their services, their experience, and, in some cases, their allegiance, as if my quiet little project had suddenly become a flag worth saluting, a territory worth colonizing now that the map had been redrawn. It was surreal, watching people who wouldn't have returned my messages a month ago now asking to grab coffee and chat synergies, like we'd always been orbiting the same sun. I didn't reply to most of them, at least not right away. I spent that morning walking the perimeter of my tiny backyard with a coffee mug in one hand and the phone in the other, ignoring the blinking notifications and instead listening to the sound of wind rattling the branches and a squirrel rustling through the dead leaves behind the garage. The sky was overcast, and the clouds hung low like the city hadn't quite decided whether to start over or collapse. I'd thought I'd feel triumphant, or at least satisfied, like I could finally exhale and let the world know I had arrived, but all I felt was the quiet weight of having made something that mattered, and the creeping awareness that the person I had to become in order to get here might not be someone I recognized anymore. Later that afternoon, my mother called again, and her voice this time was more composed, less frantic, but still lined with the confusion of someone who had watched two of her daughters become strangers to each other without understanding how it had happened. She told me Lisa had gone home, packed up her things quietly, and left in a car service without saying goodbye, that she hadn't offered an explanation, just a quiet "tell her she won," before closing the door behind her. There was no malice in my mother's tone, no judgment, just the soft bewilderment of someone who thought love would always be enough to keep the center from falling apart. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't about winning, that I hadn't set out to ruin Lisa or dismantle her company or prove anything to anyone but myself, but the words felt dishonest even as I thought them. Because somewhere along the way, I had started keeping score. What I didn't tell my mother, what I hadn't told anyone, not even Omar, who had been helping me file incorporation paperwork and set up the new development servers, was that 2 days before Lisa showed up at my door, I'd been approached by a representative from one of her original investors. A sharp, silver-haired man named Keen, who wore expensive suits and had the kind of voice that made you feel like you were being invited into a very exclusive, very old conversation. He'd reached out through a shared client and asked to meet privately, citing a potential opportunity for shared growth. I almost didn't go, but curiosity, and perhaps a little masochism, pulled me into a sleek downtown cafe where everything smelled like cedar and efficiency, and the coffee came in cups so delicate they felt like they'd crack under the weight of real decisions. Keen didn't waste time. He offered me a buyout, an aggressive, strategic acquisition that would fold Junosync into a larger enterprise platform, grant me a leadership title, a large chunk of equity, and a seat at the table I had once been too unrefined to approach. He didn't mention Lisa by name, but he didn't have to. The subtext was clear: absorb the threat, neutralize the competition, and ensure that Miratech's fall didn't spook the market or sour the firm's reputation. He made it sound like a compliment. A victory. He told me I'd be bringing balance to a volatile sector, that I could guide the direction of ethical automation from the inside. But beneath all the flattery was the same cold calculus I'd seen in Lisa's eyes too many times: better to own the storm than weather it. I asked for a day to think. He nodded, left the contract on the table, and told me, with a wink, that real leaders always knew when to walk away from the fight and let the system do the work. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tap against the window, wondering whether walking away was the same as giving in, whether accepting success on their terms made me complicit in the same system that had tried to erase me. It wasn't the money that held me up, it was the meaning. Signing that deal would mean Miratech would effectively disappear, its tech quietly absorbed, its failure spun into a strategic pivot. Lisa's name would fade, but mine would be buried alongside it in some glossy internal merger report, stripped of the rough edges that had made it real. And yet, the offer was good. Too good, maybe. Enough to secure every future I'd ever dreamed of, to hire the team I needed, to scale Junosync faster than I ever could alone. But it would also mean erasing the reason I started in the first place, to build something for the people who had been cast aside, not to sell them back to the same machine in a different wrapper. By the time the morning light broke through the clouds, I still hadn't made a decision. The contract sat on my desk and signed, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the open window. I stood in the doorway of the garage, looking at the space where it all began, where I'd rebuilt my belief in myself piece by piece while the world doubted me. I thought of Lisa, not the polished CEO version, but the little girl who used to follow me around the yard, who once cried when I left for college, who asked me to read her job applications out loud because she was afraid of missing something important. I wondered if she remembered that version of us. I wondered if I did. As the sun rose, I made a pot of coffee, turned off my phone, and stared at the contract for the better part of an hour before placing it, unmarked, in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, under a stack of blueprints and old receipts. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. Because maybe this isn't a story about winning. Maybe it's a story about choosing which part of yourself survives when the fight is over. And maybe I didn't want to become the kind of woman who saw every opportunity as a transaction, who weighed every relationship against a potential return. Maybe I had already come too close to becoming her. Or maybe, just maybe, I already had. And that, more than anything, was the part that kept me up that night, long after the victory had gone quiet, long after the headlines faded and the contracts stopped arriving, long after Lisa had disappeared into the silence she used to command so effortlessly. Because when the dust settles and there's no one left to beat, no more battles to fight, no applause, no spotlight, no one left to impress or spite, what's left is you, alone in the mirror, asking the only question that ever really mattered. Did I win? Or did I just learn how to lose like her?